Hey, my name is Rowan Smith and I want to welcome you to the Training for Trekking podcast. Now, this is the world's very first podcast which is entirely dedicated to helping you train, prepare and conquer your upcoming hike, trek or mountain adventure. So once a week, I'm going to be giving you quality and practical information on the subjects of physical preparation for trekking, dealing with altitude and nutrition on the trail, so you can know everything you need to be doing to have the best chance of a safe, enjoyable and successful adventure. So now you know what you're in for. Let's get into today's episode. Okay, so welcome to today's episode of the Training for Trekking podcast. Now, today we're going to be talking about a very, very hot subject in the hiking, trekking, and basically mountain sports world, and something that's a little bit controversial at the moment, and that is simulated altitude training. Now, I'm sure if you've been planning an altitude adventure or if you're just active in the community, you've seen these altitude training gyms pop up more and more wherever you're living. And I'm sure you've seen the advertisements for the altitude sleeping tents and the masks and all these claims that these things can do for you. And these companies like to claim a whole bunch of things. So things like it'll help prevent altitude sickness. It will pre-acclimatize you before you go on the mountain. It'll increase your endurance, your power, your speed, your strength, improve weight loss, increase injury reduction, improved immune support, and basically just everything under the sun that it will help you on the mountain and in your training. So today we're going to be diving a little bit into this subject. I'm going to be explaining what this type of training actually is, what it is good for based off the evidence that's around at the moment, and what it's actually not good for. Now, to start with, the reason I'm talking about this today is because there's a lot of people pushing this on a lot of trekkers, and it really does bother me. So I'll say I do have a bit of a biased opinion because I'm not a huge believer in it, but I'm going to be giving you the facts as much as I can say in an unbiased way. Now, the reason I know so much about this is for myself, I worked in an altitude gym for a couple of years. I am a certified altitude trainer, which in all honesty doesn't mean very much because the certification only takes a few hours to complete. But seeing I was working in that environment and I was dealing with trekkers every single day, I sort of made it my mission to look a little bit deeper, look at all the research papers, the studies, and really try to understand exactly what was happening in this environment and exactly what I could be telling people that actually works, because I have a real issue if I'm telling people the wrong things and it doesn't really line up with my values. So I had to take the time for myself to learn about it. So today I'm going to be sharing about it with you. So basically, the simulated altitude environments that you'll commonly find on the market, whether it's a training chamber, whether it's a tent or a mask, the way that these things actually simulate altitude is what they'll do is they'll pump nitrogen into whatever sealed environment you have. And what that will do is that will lower the percentage of oxygen in the air. And that in turn will drop something that's called your blood oxygen saturation levels, which happens naturally at altitude as itself. Now, this is very, very different to what actually happens at natural altitude. So at natural altitude, the oxygen concentration in the air will actually stay the same. But what will change the further you go up is the air pressure. And this basically means that the further you go up, the more the oxygen particles in the air will disperse, meaning each breath you take in, you're getting in less oxygen. And this will also drop your blood oxygen saturation. And in the early days of this type of training, when all the early studies were coming out, people assumed that just because this oxygen saturation in your blood was dropping, doesn't matter how it happened, you could still stimulate the same adaptations. But in recent days, and in the last 10 years or so, it's really been shown it definitely can't be considered the same thing. And sometimes you'll see when you dig into the claims that a few of the companies make on their websites, they'll quote studies, which unfortunately it's talking about natural altitude and not actually this simulated environment. So that's the first issue that we have to be aware of. So now we're just going to run down the list of all the different claims that these companies like to make for these environments, and we're just going to dig into a little bit more detail whether they're true or not. So to start with, we're going to talk about preventing altitude sickness, which is probably the number one most controversial claim these types of companies make, which does draw a lot of people in because a lot of people are very, very anxious about preparing for altitude and dealing with this sickness. So yeah, we're just going to dig into that. So when you're looking at the research, at the moment, there is no direct evidence to prove that simulated altitude training in a normobaric environment can help prevent altitude sickness. Now, there's been a whole bunch of research on this so far, even though it's relatively new. There is nothing that's really pointing in a firm, significant way that it can help prevent altitude sickness. Now, a lot of people like to throw out claims that it has been proven to work, but when you actually look at the details, there are a few things that are a bit flawed about these claims. So to start with, there have been a few research studies that have shown training in a simulated hyperbaric environment, which is the one I talked about before, which isn't readily available to the public, can help reduce symptoms of altitude sickness. Now, I have seen on the internet a few people use these studies to back up claims in their normobaric environment, which is the regularly available one. So you just need to be aware of there. And the other side of things is there have been some studies that have shown training in a simulated normobaric environment can help prevent some symptoms of altitude sickness, but only when you're going to be training in another normobaric environment further in the future. So it doesn't really do anything for the mountain, but it purely prevents sickness from going from room to room, and that's very, very important to know. Number 2 is a big claim that many people make is it can help you pre-acclimatize to getting to the mountain. So a lot of the adaptations that happen when you're up at altitude, you can do that back at home, and that's going to speed up your acclimatization process. So when you're looking at the altitude training, probably one of the biggest adaptations you're chasing is an increase in red blood cell count and an increase in hemoglobin count. And that happens when you're up at altitude after, I think after a week or two. The process is a little bit delayed. It doesn't happen immediately, but that's a big adaptation that happens. Now, these rooms have been shown to help that. It has been shown to increase your hemoglobin count. However, it does take quite a long time for this to happen. So the studies or the reviews of the studies that I've looked at in when you're sleeping in a tent is studies that have shown 100 hours of you sleeping in a tent haven't shown any significant results for increase in hemoglobin count. It had to be up to over 150 hours of you sleeping in a tent for there to be any significant change. And so what this points to is, yes, it can help, and it can help these adaptations happen before you go. However, you have to put a lot of time into it, and it has to be really, really committed. And if you're just jumping into a training gym for 30, 40 minutes a few times a week, that's not really going to add up. And instead, you need to be sleeping in an environment 8 hours a night for however many hours it's going to get you to that 150 hours. So that's something to be very, very aware of. So next we're going to talk about endurance performance, and this is probably one of the things that I find has the most benefits for anyone participating in altitude training. So basically, when you're training in an altitude environment, everything's a little bit harder, your blood oxygen saturation drops, a whole bunch of stuff happens in the body, and it has been shown to be relatively beneficial for improving endurance performance in a number of ways. So for example, if you're doing a workout at sea level and you're going for a run for 5 kilometers and you go into an altitude environment, you do the same run at the same speed, you're going to get more benefits from doing it in an altitude environment. However, to be aware here is your recovery rates are a little bit slower after altitude. So if you are training very, very hard and very, very regularly, it can be a little bit more difficult to recover from this. And some people do report disturbed sleep, which also can affect your recovery. But all in all, it can be quite beneficial for your endurance performance. Now, this is relatively important to note because one of the big issues with altitude sickness is, one of the big risks of altitude sickness, I should say, is physical exhaustion. So the more endurance you can build, less chance you'll reach that physical exhaustion. And in theory, the less chance you'll have suffering from altitude sickness. However, you can still build endurance performance in outside an altitude environment 100%. The choice is purely up to you. So next, another big claim is that training in a simulated altitude environment can help improve your muscle strength and muscle power. And particularly muscle strength is very, very important for a trekker's success, so this is very interesting to look into. But to skip all the science, skip all the detail, basically the studies that have shown this as an increase, they've been really, really flawed and really, really biased, and they haven't really, if you look at it with clear eyes, it doesn't really show that it's very, very effective. So I would say if you're looking for muscle strength or muscle power, training in an altitude environment probably isn't your best bet. Next off is weight loss, which is often claimed can be really, really beneficial. And this is one of the things it can be really good for, purely for the fact is when you're in these rooms or in these environments, you burn more calories for every given task than you would out at sea level. So if you walked 5 kilometers outside or walked 5 kilometers inside the room, you would burn more calories when you're inside the room. And this can be quite beneficial for weight loss. So what we've just talked about is sort of what the direct evidence has shown. So what the research studies have done, what the scientists or the sports scientists have done in their labs or whatever, and that's what has come to light at the moment. However, to be very, very clear, sometimes the research on new types of training can be a little bit far behind. And it does take a lot of money and a lot of time to organize studies, and sometimes people in the trenches seem to know things a little bit sooner than the scientists. So when you're actually talking to trekkers who've used these environments, there seems to be a reasonable amount of anecdotal evidence, meaning that they've said so themselves, that it can be very beneficial for relieving symptoms of altitude sickness, so predominantly the headache and the shortness of breath, in the first couple of days at moderate altitude. So if you're going on a trek, usually the first few days, you might get a little bit headachy, you might get a bit of short of breath, and after a few days of slowly going up the mountain, this usually levels out. So anecdotally, people are saying, look, it gets a little bit easier in the first few days. Eventually, after a few days after that, it does level out with everyone once they've got that first acclimatization. But that's sort of what a lot of people tend to be saying. So that is interesting to know, because if you are incredibly stressed out about going to altitude and you are worried about the first few days, maybe that might be an idea looking into. But as my personal opinion, when altitude training should be incorporated for a trekker coming up to altitude, is it should be used as the icing on the cake in your preparations and not the entire cake. Now, what I mean by that is when you're training for a trek, your things of importance go from your aerobic capacity, which is basically your long duration, steady training, your strength training and injury prevention, your trail training, so actually getting out in a specific environment and moving and getting used to the uneven terrain, your nutrition, and then once all of that is sorted, maybe thinking about altitude training. Unfortunately, a lot of people are told that this is just a one-stop shop, which will sort everything out, but in my opinion, not really a good way to go about that. And if you are just solely using altitude training as a way to get ready and hoping it'll prepare you for an altitude environment, you're probably going to be in for a bit of a rude shock. So that's my 2 cents on the subject of simulated altitude training. Basically, to sum it up, yes, it can have some benefits, but if you are going to do it, you have to put a lot of time behind it, which will work out to be a fair amount of money, and you should only really consider it if you're nailing all your other aspects of your training first. So I hope you've enjoyed that today. I hope it's cleared a few things up. I know there's a lot of information in there, so if you do not understand anything I've said, or you want some clarification, or you even want to see the studies that I've been talking about, please swing me an email, swing me a message, and I'm more than happy to help. But aside from that, enjoy the day, guys, and we'll talk to you very, very soon. You've been listening to the Training for Trekking podcast. So if you've enjoyed this episode, please remember to subscribe, rate, and review us in iTunes. So thanks for getting involved, and we'll see you on the next one.